Hi, this is Spencer Sharp, and I'm doing my presentation this week on podcasts and business. I'm going to start with an overview of the presentation. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about why should a business use podcasts. Then I'm going to follow that up with what benefits do podcasts give over other marketing tools, followed by the demand for podcasts today, um, and then follow that by examples of podcasts being used in today's modern world. And then I'm going to go and offer some recommendations of companies that I think could use podcasts to reach a new clientele and begin to reach the younger generations. And then I'm going to end with discussion questions. The first thing I'm going to tackle with my first slide as we jump into the presentation is why should a business use a podcast? So when asked that, most people will jump to, well, advertisement and increasing sales, which that's a great reason. You're able to promote your new products and your new services, and say, this is what we have coming. These are the things that are going to help you in your day-to-day life. But it's also a very unique form of advertisement, and you are able to advertise by providing storytelling, entertainment, education, things like this, and while advertising at the same time. And it's also a very targeted form of advertisement where you're meeting your customers exactly where they are, which is on their smartphones for most modern generations. People can go to Apple Podcasts or wherever people download their podcasts and instantly get one off their smartphone, and they will see your advertisements. Um, this sets you apart from your competition by being a very unique form of advertisement. Most companies haven't went to podcasting in business, so this is something where you can get ahead of the game and begin to get a loyal fan base and loyal customers. And that leads into my third point of why to podcast, and that is it builds a strong brand name, trust from your consumers, and authority. So my example that I was coming up with when I was thinking about like what this point means is when I want to go to a company, I want them to have the authority to say, yes, this is right or wrong. This is the best product. So something that I'm really interested in is video games. So if a company such as GameStop, one of the number one video game sellers, had a podcast stating, these are awesome games, these are great games, and then as they talk about them, they say what they like and dislike about them, and those games go on to be awesome and great games when I play them, that's going to build an authority that they have over other markets that sell video games, such as Walmart or Amazon. Um, this also, the podcast will build your brand name up where people will go to you for because they know that they can trust you. Um, Another uniqueness to podcasting is that it creates a community and it builds a relationship with the client as you're connecting with a person speaking at rather than connecting to a commercial or a something you're reading. It's much easier to connect to somebody that you're hearing weekly, monthly, and you can respond to them and begin to comment, or they can have consumers on and interview them or talk to them. Anything that's building a strong community that's going to encourage this brand loyalty. And last, and probably least, is a source of income. And yes, that's great that podcasts can make money. This is not something that's going to happen right off the bat. So you have to lead to advertisements, partnerships, sponsors, things like this. So while they can make money, and that is a huge deal for going into podcasts, this isn't something you would expect to see right off the bat. As we jump into this next slide, I want to go over my SWOT analysis for why a business should start up a podcast. So we kind of went over the strengths and the opportunities in the last slide, but there are a few strengths I want to highlight. First is they can be easily accessible by most consumers. Most people have smartphones today, and as I said, you're meeting them in their market. Second, it's very good for our busy society today. We tend to like doing things while multitasking. So maybe you're going for a run, or maybe you're in the car, you pop a podcast on in, and you're meeting the consumer while they're doing their other busy things they do throughout the day. And last, once the podcast is set up, it becomes very inexpensive to have one or two people hosting a podcast. This going coming up with things to talk about, talking with consumers, and meeting them. When it comes to weaknesses, there is a startup expense. While podcasts become inexpensive once you've paid for your equipment and found the right person, that beginning equipment expense is going to cost a decent chunk of money. Also, the community I've been talking about, it can be very difficult to create. There are a lot of podcasts that get started and never find their target market. And then also, while accessibility was a strength for most people who have smartphones, there is still that weakness of people who haven't made the jump over to the smartphone generation yet. Um, when it comes to opportunities, brand development is a huge one. We've talked about that. It's just something that the bigger your brand is, the more loyal your customers are going to be. But I did want to highlight the connecting with employees and teaching new skills. So podcasts aren't something that only work for consumers. They can also be used to give your employees an update on day-to-day activities throughout your company or to teach new skills. Um, and then threats, there were two big ones that I came up with. One are competing podcasts who already have an audience. There are a lot of podcasts who are huge out there. You're competing with the time of these podcasts for listeners who only have so much time in their car whenever they listen to podcasts. And then also other entertainment industries such as Netflix or Spotify, things that are taking up your consumers' time where they won't be listening to your podcast. I want to use this next slide to go over the market demand for podcasts. Nearly 1 out of 3 people listen to a podcast on a monthly basis. Uh, when we apply this to the American population, that means that about 100 million people actively listen to podcasts each month. To put that number in perspective, that's about the same number of Americans that go to church on a weekend. The next point I want to make is 2018 to 2019 is the largest growth in podcasts since 2006. This comes straight from the senior vice president of Edison Research, Tom Webster, it runs a company that tracks business trends. I took this information and put it down in a graph here at the bottom left. This graph shows since 2014, the jump of active podcast listeners in the population. As you can see, it's not only doubled in the past 6 years, 2018 to 2019 was also the biggest jump in the past 6 years. Not only is the general population beginning to listen to podcasts more and more, but even the elderly, age 55 and older, the ones who tend to not have smartphones or be slower to this audience, is connecting at a 20% rate. So 20% of those ages 55 and older are listening to podcasts once a month, and age 12 to 24 have experienced in the past year from 2018 to 2019 a 10% growth in active podcast listening. On my next slide, I have 3 modern examples of companies using podcasts for all different reasons and how they've become effective with their podcasts. The first example is Perfect North Slopes. For those of you who don't know what Perfect North is, it's a skiing and tubing company that has modified snow so you can go skiing and tubing anytime throughout the winter through probably the last 4 months of the year and the first 2 or 3. So they run a podcast that is a daily podcast, and this podcast can be anywhere from 2 minutes long to 15 minutes long. And the first thing what they do it every day for is a weather report. They tell you this is how much snow we have, this is how deep it is, these are the slopes that are open, and this is the temperature of the day. This is the kind of weather you can expect. When the podcasts become longer, it's when they're informing the clients about upcoming events they have going on. They might have their annual equipment sale, and they're going to explain this is what we have on sale, this is all the new things we got in this year, this is what you should be buying to make it down the slopes with the most speed and having the most fun. They also might advertise their ski lodge parties that they do occasionally, or something like their New Year's Eve party. Um, this is a podcast that's daily, perfectly for their audience. This isn't one that's going to be building a community. It's going to be giving information that clients need, and they can go on, listen to the podcast, and know, okay, today I can go to the slopes, and this is what I can expect. The second example that I've came up with is Fidelity Investments, which is my employer, has a employee podcast that we can listen to on the back end, the transaction processing side of the company. This podcast can do multiple things. It can give us updates of new processes, new software, or anything that's coming up in the corporation that we can expect to see within the next 3 to 6 months. Um, the second thing that the podcast does is it kind of connects us all to being one community. It says this is what's going on in each individual business unit, and this is how they're succeeding. This is what they can use help with. This is what we're doing to attack their problems, or this is maybe what we've came up with. Maybe somebody's came up with a new macro that can be used across teams. Anything like that. It really builds a culture of interconnecting business units. This podcast is also used often for onboarding. We have an employee like onboarding podcast that can say, okay, these are the things that you need to do before you're considered a like experienced full-time employee. You know what you're doing. This is just get your feet wet. The third podcast is another Fidelity Investments podcast, and this is for the community. This is for consumers, and its main goal is to build a strong brand name for Fidelity Investments while giving them authority in the market. In this podcast, they talk about a range of different things, going from financial wellness to what it's like to work at Fidelity Investments. This gives them the community. They encourage. They talk to different employees and say what they do. It really makes Fidelity feel like a business that you can trust and a brand name that you want to support. This also comes in use as a podcast when it comes to advertising new services, such as the student debt repayment plan that's recently been launched. This is something that they can say, hey, here's our upcoming features, and then they can discuss student debt, how it's affecting our population, how we can pay it off, and then what Fidelity can do with their new services. Moving on, I have my recommendation slide. So these are two companies that throughout the past 4 weeks, the length of the class, I've came up with recommendations of who should be using a podcast. The first one is Air Canada. Obviously, from our first case study, I kind of started thinking about this when it came to recommendations. I think it would be very cool if they did a traveling podcast. This would provide marketing for their flights. While showing an expertise in the industry and giving them that strong brand name. And they can also discuss flight promotions. So maybe one day they have cheaper flights to the Bahamas. Well, they can talk about here's all the amazing things you can do in the Bahamas and here's why people travel here. I think this is a great idea for Air Canada to be able to bring their consumers to them and see them as a leading expertise in the market. Next, I have Netflix, and I think they should provide a TV reviewing podcast. This would be a podcast mostly for entertainment, but it will build a strong community of what we call binge watchers. People will want to stick with Netflix because by building this community, they'll be able to watch shows that aren't available anywhere else, like Stranger Things. This podcast can also recommend new shows. So maybe you like Stranger Things. Well, go check out this other Netflix exclusive. And this is going to keep your viewers engaged and coming back to your service over and over again while telling their friends about new shows. And then lastly, they can also provide advertisement for their new Netflix exclusives. When they get a new comedy act that's exclusively to Netflix, they can provide advertisement. Say, hey, don't forget, in 3 months, we have this new thing coming out. So I want to leave you guys with a couple of discussion questions. These are things I hope that we can get a discussion going with. My first question is, do you feel like podcasting is a successful marketing tool? Does it help build a sense of customer loyalty? Second, should podcasts be used by more businesses to keep employees informed the way Fidelity Investments does? Third, can you think of any current examples of businesses that use podcasts? Are they successful? Where can they be improved? And fourth, are there any businesses you think could benefit from a podcast? If so, what kind of podcasts? And lastly, I have my works cited. Thank you guys for listening, and I'm hoping that we can come up with some great recommendations for podcasts being used in business.